There's a specific kind of fear that comes from a doctor looking at you with genuine confusion, not because they don't understand your symptoms, but because they don't understand why your chart says you have symptoms you've never actually had. My name is Melissa. I'm 36 years old, and for almost 3 years, I believed I was managing a rare, slowly worsening autoimmune condition, one that explained the fatigue, the joint pain, the specialists, the medications I took every morning without question, because that's what you do when someone in a white coat tells you your body is failing you in a specific, documented way. What I didn't know, until a records request I made almost by accident, was that a significant portion of that documented decline had never actually happened. Not the diagnosis. Not several of the specialist visits. Not, as it turned out, 2 of the doctor's signatures attached to my own medical history. My husband, Ryan, had spent nearly 3 years quietly building a paper trail of a terminal illness I never had, feeding false symptoms into my actual medical file, forging documentation where the real doctors wouldn't cooperate, all in service of a life insurance policy worth just over $2 million, taken out on my life, with him as the sole beneficiary, 22 months before the fatigue even started. He didn't want me to get better. I understand that now with a clarity I wish I didn't have. He wanted the paper trail to prove, convincingly, permanently, that I was already dying. And the most unsettling part of this story isn't even the forgery. It's what I found when I looked into who Ryan actually was before he was my husband, and who else had once shared his name. That I met Ryan 7 years ago at a mutual friend's dinner party, and what I remember most from that first night wasn't romantic in the way you'd expect, it was practical. Someone's car wouldn't start in the driveway afterward, and Ryan, without being asked, spent 20 minutes in the cold with jumper cables, talking the stranded guest through it calmly while the rest of us stood around uselessly. That's who Ryan was, consistently, for years. The person who handled things. The person who noticed a problem before anyone else did and simply, quietly, solved it. He worked in the insurance industry, underwriting commercial policies for a regional firm, which meant he understood, far better than I ever did, the language and mechanics of exactly the kind of document he'd eventually build against me. At the time, it just felt like a boring, stable job that made him unusually good at handling our own finances. He managed our budget, our retirement accounts, our various policies, and I was, honestly, relieved to have a partner who found that kind of administrative complexity engaging rather than exhausting, because I never had. We got married 4 years into dating, in a small ceremony neither of our families particularly cared for the size of, but that felt right for us. Ryan proposed the way he did most things, thoughtfully, a little formally, with a plan already half executed before he told me what the plan even was. He'd already spoken to my father, already researched 3 ring options he thought I'd like, already picked a date that avoided every conflict on both our families' calendars. I used to describe this quality of his to friends as taking care of everything, and I meant it, at the time, entirely as a compliment. About 22 months into our marriage, without me knowing, Ryan took out a life insurance policy on me. I want to be precise about the timeline here, because it matters enormously to everything that came after. This wasn't a joint decision, made together the way we'd handled every other financial choice in our marriage. I signed nothing. I don't recall a conversation about it at all. I would later learn, through the claims investigation that eventually followed, that Ryan had used his professional relationships within the insurance industry to expedite and, in certain respects, obscure the underwriting process in ways an ordinary applicant wouldn't have had access to, including, critically, arranging for the policy's contestability period, the standard 2-year window during which an insurer can investigate and deny a claim for material misrepresentation, to begin quietly ticking down well before I ever showed a single symptom of illness. Gregory explained this specific mechanic to me later in far more detail than I understood at the time, and I think it's worth sharing, because it's the piece of this entire scheme that reveals just how deliberately it was engineered rather than opportunistic. Insurers scrutinize claims filed within that initial 2-year contestability window far more heavily than claims filed after it closes, specifically to catch exactly this kind of fraud, someone taking out a policy shortly before an anticipated death and then filing quickly. By ensuring the policy predated my symptoms by several months, and by building a slow, gradual, medically plausible decline over multiple years rather than a sudden one, Ryan had effectively designed the entire scheme to look, from an insurer's perspective, like precisely the kind of unremarkable, long-term policy that draws the least investigative scrutiny when a claim eventually arrives. I didn't know any of this at the time, obviously. At the time, life simply continued the way it does. Work, small arguments about whose turn it was to do the dishes, weekend trips to visit his parents, the ordinary architecture of a marriage that felt, from the inside, entirely unremarkable in the best possible way. The fatigue started about 4 months after that policy was quietly finalized, and I want to describe what those 3 years actually felt like from the inside, because I think it matters for understanding how completely this deceived me, and because I've since learned I wasn't imagining or exaggerating anything. The symptoms I experienced were real. What wasn't real was the explanation for them. It started small. Persistent tiredness that felt disproportionate to how I was actually living, sleeping enough, eating reasonably, not under any specific unusual stress. Then joint pain, mild at first, then more consistent, migrating between my hands and knees in a pattern that felt, when I finally saw a doctor about it, genuinely concerning rather than dismissible. Ryan was, throughout this entire period, extraordinarily attentive, driving me to appointments, taking detailed notes during consultations I was often too exhausted or anxious to fully absorb myself, following up with specialists on my behalf when I didn't have the energy to make the calls myself. I remember, at the time, feeling an almost overwhelming gratitude for how present he was through what felt like a frightening, uncertain medical situation. Friends commented on it. My mother told me, more than once, how lucky I was to have a husband who took my health so seriously. I remember specific evenings from that period with a clarity that feels almost cruel to me now. Ryan sitting beside me on the couch, gently explaining a new lab result in careful, reassuring language, telling me the trend was still within an expected range for this kind of condition, language I now understand he had learned to speak fluently precisely because he had constructed the entire condition himself. I remember him researching, or appearing to research, alternative treatments, bringing home articles about dietary changes that might help manage my symptoms, sitting with me through the specific, quiet despair that comes with an illness that has no clear timeline and no clear cure. In hindsight, I understand that performance took real, sustained effort, and I still don't know whether that effort came from genuine, twisted affection, or simply from an understanding that the performance needed to be convincing enough to survive years of daily scrutiny from the one person closest to it. What I didn't know was that a portion of what Ryan reported to me after those follow-up calls with specialists didn't accurately reflect what those specialists had actually said. What I didn't know was that some of the documentation I eventually saw, printouts Ryan would occasionally show me from what he described as the patient portal, summarizing test results or specialist notes, had, in at least several instances, been altered or fabricated entirely before I ever laid eyes on them. The diagnosis, when it finally came, arrived through a doctor I'd genuinely seen, genuinely trusted, a rheumatologist named Dr. Patterson, who diagnosed me with what she described as an atypical, slow-progressing autoimmune condition, difficult to definitively confirm through any single test, requiring ongoing monitoring rather than a clean diagnostic moment. I want to be clear about something here, because it matters for what comes later. Dr. Patterson, as far as the investigation eventually determined, was not involved in any wrongdoing. She diagnosed me honestly, based on real symptoms I was genuinely experiencing and real test results that were, at least initially, unaltered. What happened after that initial diagnosis, over the following 2.5 years, is where the fabrication truly accelerated. Additional specialist consultations, ones I had only partial, fatigue-blurred memory of actually attending, generated chart notes describing progressively worsening symptoms that didn't fully match what I actually remembered experiencing. New medications appeared in my treatment plan that I now understand were never actually prescribed by any doctor at all, medications Ryan sourced independently and told me were part of my treatment regimen, medications that, disturbingly, may have contributed to some of the very fatigue and cognitive fog I was attributing entirely to my supposed illness. I trusted the process completely, because I trusted the person managing it completely. That is, I understand now, precisely how something like this survives for years without detection. The first genuine crack came from a source so mundane I almost dismissed it entirely, a call from my pharmacy's automated refill system, notifying me that a prescription was ready for pickup that I had no memory of my doctor ever prescribing. I called the pharmacy directly, confused, assuming some kind of administrative mix-up. The pharmacist confirmed the prescription had come through under my name, under my insurance, authorized by a doctor's name I didn't recognize at all, not Dr. Patterson, not any specialist I remembered seeing, a name entirely unfamiliar to me despite supposedly being, according to the pharmacy's own records, a physician who had been treating me for the better part of a year. I called Dr. Patterson's office directly, asking if they could clarify who this doctor was, whether it was someone within their practice I simply hadn't personally interacted with. The office manager who took my call sounded confused in a way that unsettled me more than an ordinary administrative error would have. She told me no one by that name had ever worked at their practice, and that she had no record of any referral to that doctor ever being made on my behalf. I sat with that confusion for several days before mentioning it to Ryan, partly because I genuinely believed there was some reasonable explanation I simply hadn't found yet, and partly, I think now, because some quiet, half-formed part of me was already afraid of what it might mean if there wasn't one. When I finally did mention it to him, his explanation came quickly, smoothly, with a specific kind of detail that, at the time, felt reassuring rather than suspicious. He said it must have been a covering physician during Dr. Patterson's maternity leave the previous year, someone whose name had simply never fully registered with me given how unwell I'd been feeling during that period. It was a plausible explanation. Dr. Patterson had, in fact, taken maternity leave around that general time frame, a detail Ryan clearly knew, and clearly used deliberately, because it lent his explanation a foundation of real, verifiable fact even though the specific claim built on top of that foundation was entirely false. I let it go. I want to be honest about that, the way I've been honest in every story I've told you before. I didn't immediately suspect my husband of fabricating my medical history. I suspected an administrative error, accepted a reasonable-sounding explanation, and continued managing what I believed was a real, worsening illness, because that belief had, by that point, been carefully constructed over more than 2 years of consistent, patient reinforcement. The second crack came almost 8 months later, and this time, I couldn't explain it away. I decided, somewhat abruptly, to seek a second opinion from a specialist entirely outside our usual network, a decision driven less by suspicion and more by a growing, exhausted frustration with a treatment plan that, despite 3 years of consistent management, seemed to be doing very little to actually improve how I felt. To facilitate that second opinion, I needed my complete medical records transferred, which meant submitting a formal records request directly to every provider I'd supposedly seen over the previous 3 years, rather than relying on the summarized version Ryan had always handled and relayed to me. What came back, over the following 2 weeks, was a set of documents that didn't fully match my own memory of my medical history, in ways too specific and too numerous to attribute to simple imprecision or the ordinary blurriness of a difficult few years. There were visit notes for specialist consultations on dates I could cross-reference against my own calendar and confirm I'd actually been at work that day, not at any medical appointment. There were chart entries describing symptoms in language that felt subtly wrong, clinically accurate but emotionally disconnected from how I actually would have described what I was experiencing to a doctor in my own words. There was, most disturbingly, a signature on several documents from the unfamiliar doctor whose name had come up during the pharmacy incident, a name Dr. Patterson's own office had confirmed had never worked at their practice, appearing now, in ink, on official-looking chart documentation I was holding in my own hands. I did something, at that point, that I'm genuinely grateful I had the presence of mind to do. Given how disoriented I felt, I didn't confront Ryan immediately. I quietly, methodically, began comparing every document in that records packet against my own memory, my own calendar, my own recollection of every appointment I could actually verify having attended, building a private, careful map of what was real and what wasn't, the same instinct that's guided every investigation I've ever had to conduct into my own life. Over roughly 3 weeks, working mostly late at night after Ryan had gone to sleep, I identified 11 separate documents I could not verify as genuine, chart notes, lab result summaries, and, in 3 specific instances, entire consultation records for appointments with providers I had no memory of ever meeting, attached to a doctor's license number that, when I looked it up through my state's medical board website, out of a growing, careful suspicion, didn't correspond to any actual licensed physician at all. Once I understood that at least part of my medical history had been fabricated, the obvious question became why, what possible purpose this elaborate, sustained deception could serve. I didn't arrive at the answer through any dramatic discovery. I arrived at it through our own filing cabinet, going through documents I'd walked past 100 times without ever really looking closely at them, because Ryan had always handled our financial paperwork, and I'd simply never had reason to dig through it myself. I found the policy in a folder labeled, unremarkably, insurance, alongside our actual, legitimate home and auto coverage. A life insurance policy on my life, issued just over 2 years before my symptoms had ever started, valued at slightly over $2 million, with Ryan listed as the sole primary beneficiary. I had no memory of applying for this policy. I had no memory of a medical exam associated with it, though the paperwork indicated one had been conducted. I had no memory, most importantly, of ever signing the application at all, though a signature, my signature, or a very convincing approximation of it, appeared on every required line. I sat on the floor of our home office for a long time with that folder open in my lap, doing the same thing I've had to do in every story I've ever told you, building a timeline, laying every piece of evidence I now had against the actual chronology of my life, looking for the pattern. And the pattern, once I let myself actually see it instead of explaining it away, was almost unbearably clear. A large policy, taken out quietly, without my knowledge. A documented, progressively worsening illness beginning shortly afterward. A steady, 3-year accumulation of medical documentation specifically designed, I now understood, to survive the exact kind of scrutiny an insurance company applies when evaluating a large claim, a paper trail robust enough, consistent enough, medically plausible enough, to make a terminal decline look thoroughly, unquestionably documented, rather than sudden or convenient in a way that might draw investigative attention. I want to be honest about the specific horror of that realization, because I don't think words fully capture it even now. I hadn't just discovered that my husband had lied to me. I discovered that for 3 years, while I believed the person I trusted most was helping me survive a frightening illness, he had actually been methodically building the exact kind of documentation that would make my death, whenever and however it eventually occurred, financially convenient and medically unremarkable. I didn't confront him that night. I needed, first, to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with, and some instinct I still can't fully explain told me to look further back than our own marriage before I did anything else. That I want to tell you about the discovery that changed the entire shape of this investigation, because up until this point, as disturbing as everything already was, I still believed I was dealing with a singular, contained scheme, born out of some specific financial pressure or motive unique to our own marriage. While searching for any additional documentation related to the insurance policy, I came across an old file box in our garage, one I'd always assumed contained nothing more than outdated tax returns and warranty paperwork from before we'd met. Buried near the bottom, I found a folder of documents from a period of Ryan's life he had, in 7 years together, genuinely never once mentioned to me, a marriage certificate, dated nearly a decade before we met, to a woman named Elaine. I confronted Ryan about almost nothing throughout this entire investigation until I had complete certainty, but I broke that pattern here, briefly, asking him directly, carefully, whether he'd been married before. He confirmed it, somewhat defensively, framing it as a brief, unremarkable early marriage that had ended in an amicable divorce years before we'd ever met, not something he'd deliberately hidden so much as simply never found reason to bring up. I didn't believe that framing, not after everything else I'd already found, and I spent the following 2 weeks doing something I never imagined I'd need to do, tracking down a woman I'd never met, who had once been married to my own husband, through a combination of public divorce records and, eventually, a shared acquaintance from Ryan's hometown who still had contact with her. The search itself was slower and more frustrating than I expected. Public divorce records in the state where Ryan and Elaine had married gave me a filing date and confirmed the marriage had legally ended, but revealed almost nothing about the circumstances, and Elaine herself, it turned out, had moved twice since then and changed her professional name after remarrying, making a simple internet search largely useless. It was only through a chain of increasingly distant social connections, a cousin of a coworker who'd grown up near Ryan's childhood home, that I finally found someone willing to pass along a message on my behalf, since I had no direct way to reach Elaine myself and didn't want my first contact with her to feel like an ambush. I reached out to Elaine cautiously, uncertain what to even say, uncertain whether she'd want anything to do with a stranger reaching out about her ex-husband years after their marriage had ended. She responded within a day, and what she told me over the phone, in a conversation that lasted nearly 2 hours, confirmed a fear I'd been carrying since I first found her marriage certificate but hadn't yet let myself fully articulate. Elaine told me that during the final 2 years of her own marriage to Ryan, She too had experienced a slow, medically documented decline, persistent fatigue, unexplained symptoms, a series of specialist visits she remembered attending with a strange, foggy inconsistency she'd never fully understood at the time. She told me she'd never received a formal diagnosis the way I had, because she'd left the marriage before things progressed that far, not because she suspected fraud, not at the time, but because Ryan's increasingly controlling management of her medical care, his insistence on handling every appointment, every conversation with her doctors, had begun to feel suffocating in a way she couldn't fully name until she'd finally put some distance between them. It was only years later, she told me, going through old paperwork during an unrelated move, that she'd found a life insurance policy Ryan had taken out on her during their marriage, one she'd never signed for, one that had lapsed, unclaimed, sometime after their divorce was finalized. She said she'd never pursued it legally, partly out of exhaustion, partly out of a desire to simply be done with that entire chapter of her life, and had spent years since quietly wondering, with a discomfort she'd never fully resolved, what exactly she had almost been the victim of, and how close she might have come to a very different outcome had she stayed. I sat with that phone call for a long time after we hung up. I wasn't the first. I was, as far as either of us could determine, the second attempt at the exact same elaborate scheme, refined and pursued considerably further the second time, closer to completion than Elaine had ever allowed it to become. Before I brought any of this to Gregory formally, I asked Elaine if she'd be willing to meet me in person, somewhere neutral, a small coffee shop roughly halfway between our two cities. I wasn't entirely sure what I expected walking into that meeting, some version of comparing notes, maybe, two strangers united by a terrible coincidence. What I got instead was something more complicated, and in its own way, more useful than I could have anticipated. Elaine arrived early. She was, I noticed almost immediately, a careful, watchful presence, the kind of person who'd clearly spent years since her marriage rebuilding a specific, deliberate sense of control over her own life. She told me, within the first 10 minutes, that she'd almost not responded to the message that had eventually reached her, that some part of her had wanted this entire chapter to simply stay closed permanently, buried alongside a marriage she'd worked hard to put behind her. What changed her mind, she said, was a single detail in the message our mutual contact had relayed, that Ryan's current wife had found a life insurance policy she hadn't signed for. She said that detail specifically, more than anything else, had made staying silent feel suddenly, uncomfortably irresponsible, in a way her own unresolved discomfort over the years never quite had on its own. She walked me through her own timeline in more detail than she had over the phone, the specific moment, about 18 months into noticing her own declining health, when a friend had gently, carefully suggested she get a second opinion entirely outside the network of doctors Ryan had been managing her communication with. That second opinion, she told me, had come back clean, no evidence of the specific condition she'd been told she was managing, a discrepancy she'd initially assumed was simply a difference in diagnostic philosophy between providers rather than evidence of anything more troubling. It was only the lapsed insurance policy, found years later, that had retroactively reframed that entire discrepancy for her, turning a confusing medical inconsistency into something that looked, in hindsight, deliberately engineered. I asked her, gently, why she'd never pursued any legal action once she found that policy. She said the honest answer was exhaustion, and a specific kind of shame she still hadn't fully worked through, a feeling that pursuing it would mean publicly, formally acknowledging how completely she'd once trusted someone capable of something this calculated, a vulnerability she said she simply hadn't been ready to expose to a courtroom, or to her own family, at that point in her life. Sitting across from her, I understood something about my own situation I hadn't fully articulated to myself yet. Elaine's silence, understandable and hard one as it was, hadn't protected anyone. It had simply given Ryan more time, more practice, more opportunity to refine the exact same scheme against someone else. I didn't say that to her directly, not in those words, because I didn't think it was fair to place that weight on a decision she'd made under circumstances I could genuinely understand. But it clarified, for me, with total certainty, that silence wasn't a path I was willing to choose for myself, whatever it eventually cost me to pursue this fully and publicly instead. Once I understood the full scope of what I was dealing with, I made 2 calls in quick succession, one to an attorney who specialized in insurance fraud, a careful, methodical man named Gregory who took my initial account with a seriousness that, honestly, helped steady me during what had become one of the most disorienting periods of my life, and one to my actual insurance provider's fraud investigation unit, disclosing what I'd found before Ryan had any opportunity to realize I knew and potentially destroy or alter further evidence. Gregory explained something to me that reframed the entire legal shape of what Ryan had done. Forging medical documentation isn't simply a private, personal betrayal. It constitutes several distinct categories of criminal fraud, including insurance fraud, forgery, and, given the specific involvement of a fabricated doctor's license number, impersonation of a medical professional, a charge that carries its own serious weight independent of the insurance fraud itself. He also explained that because I was, thankfully, still alive and had discovered the fraud before any claim was ever filed, the case existed in a somewhat unusual legal category, an attempted, extensively documented fraud rather than a completed one, which mattered significantly for how the investigation and eventual prosecution would proceed, but did not, he assured me, make what had happened any less serious or any less thoroughly criminal. The insurance company's own investigation moved with a swiftness that surprised me, once they understood the scope of what. The insurance company's own investigation moved with a swiftness that surprised me, once they understood the scope of what had potentially been done to circumvent their. I laid out everything on our kitchen table, the pharmacy discrepancy, the fabricated doctor's license, the insurance policy I'd never signed for, and, finally, Elaine's name, spoken aloud in our kitchen for what I have to assume was the first time in years. Ryan's composure, which had held through every smaller confrontation over the preceding weeks, finally broke at Elaine's name in a way it hadn't broken at anything else. He sat in silence for a long time before he spoke, and when he finally did, what he offered wasn't quite a confession and wasn't quite a denial. It was a strange, halting attempt to explain a mindset I don't think I'll ever fully understand, no matter how many times I turn this conversation over in my memory. He told me the policy with Elaine had started, in his account, as a genuine, reasonable financial decision. Life insurance is common, unremarkable, something responsible couples often have regardless of health. He said the fabrication, in both marriages, had begun small, almost accidentally, a single altered detail meant to smooth over some minor administrative friction with the underwriting process, and had then, gradually, become something larger, something he described, disturbingly, as easier to continue than to stop once it had already begun. I asked him directly whether he had ever intended for either of us to actually die, whether this was building towards something beyond documentation and eventual claim, and he insisted, with what I genuinely could not determine to be sincerity or self-serving denial, that no active harm had ever been planned, that the entire scheme, in both cases, had been built around eventually filing a claim upon a genuine, naturally occurring death, whenever that might happen, banking on the extensive, carefully constructed medical documentation to make that eventual claim unquestionable rather than actively causing anything himself. I don't know, even now, months later, whether I fully believe that distinction, or whether it matters as much as he seemed to want it to. What I know is that I spent 3 years believing I was dying of a real illness, taking medications that were never actually prescribed by any doctor, built entirely around a financial motive I never once suspected, from the one person in my life I trusted completely to tell me the truth about my own body. There was one more moment in that kitchen conversation I've thought about more than almost anything else since. Near the end, once the explanations had mostly run dry and we were sitting in a silence neither of us seemed to know how to break, I asked Ryan whether any part of him had ever, even once across 3 years, considered simply stopping, telling me the truth, dismantling the policy, letting the fabricated diagnosis quietly resolve itself the way real illnesses sometimes do. He said yes, more than once, particularly in the early months when the deception still felt small and reversible. He said the moment that specific option had felt genuinely available to him had passed sometime around the first year, once Dr. Patterson's real diagnosis had entered my actual chart and the fabricated details had started, in his words, growing on top of something real, in a way he no longer felt he could safely untangle without the entire structure collapsing at once. I asked why that mattered to him more than simply telling me the truth at any point along the way. He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think, honestly, he ever will. The investigation and subsequent legal proceedings took just under a year to fully resolve, moving through several overlapping tracks: the insurance fraud investigation, criminal charges related to forgery and impersonation of a medical professional, and, eventually, our own divorce, filed the same week I first confronted him, processed separately but running in parallel with everything else. Ryan was ultimately charged with multiple felony counts, including insurance fraud, forgery, and unauthorized practice tied to the fabricated physician's license he'd used across both attempted schemes. Elaine's willingness to come forward with her own account proved, according to Gregory, significant in establishing the pattern prosecutors needed to pursue the case as seriously as they ultimately did, rather than treating it as an isolated incident limited to a single marriage. I had to spend a considerable amount of time in the months that followed working with actual, legitimate doctors to formally, medically untangle which of my documented symptoms over those 3 years had been genuinely real and which had been fabricated or, in some cases, potentially induced by medications I now understood had never been legitimately prescribed. That process was, in its own quiet way, one of the harder parts of this entire ordeal, having to relearn, medically, which parts of my own body's story over 3 years I could actually trust, and which parts had been authored by someone else entirely. Gregory also walked me through a part of the legal process I hadn't fully anticipated, the involvement of my state's medical board and the licensing authority responsible for investigating the fabricated physician's license Ryan had used. Because a real, if entirely fictional, license number had been used to lend fraudulent legitimacy to several documents, the case triggered a parallel administrative investigation separate from the criminal one, examining how that specific fabricated credential had managed to pass initial scrutiny within the pharmacy and record systems it interacted with. That investigation, still ongoing as of the last update I received, has apparently already identified gaps in verification processes that several providers in our region are now working to close. A small, unplanned consequence of this entire ordeal that I take a strange, quiet satisfaction in, even amid everything else. The fatigue, it turned out, upon careful re-evaluation with genuine specialists working from my actual, verified medical history, appears to have been real, though considerably more mundane in origin than the elaborate autoimmune narrative I'd been given, a combination of stress, a minor, easily correctable vitamin deficiency, and, disturbingly, the cumulative effect of medications I should never have been taking at all. The joint pain, similarly, appears to have had a real but far less serious cause than what I'd spent 3 years believing. I think about that specifically, often, that underneath an elaborate, years-long fiction designed to convince an insurance company I was dying, there was, in fact, a real, ordinary, entirely manageable set of health issues that a legitimate doctor could likely have resolved within months, had I ever had the chance to seek care that wasn't quietly, deliberately being steered toward a fabricated terminal narrative instead that I've spent a lot of time since all of this trying to understand what allowed a scheme this elaborate, this sustained, to work on me for as long as it did, and I don't think the answer is that I was unusually naive or unusually easy to deceive. I think the answer is that Ryan understood, with real precision, exactly how trust works inside a marriage, that we don't verify the people we love the way we'd verify a stranger, because verification itself can feel, in the moment, like its own small betrayal of the relationship. I've also had to sit with the specific, strange grief of not being able to fully trust my own memory of the last several years of my life, knowing that a meaningful portion of what I believed was happening to my own body was, in fact, a carefully maintained fiction. That's a particular kind of disorientation I don't think this story fully prepared me for even as I lived through it, and one I'm still, honestly, working through with a therapist who specializes in this specific, unusual category of medical and financial betrayal. What's helped most, beyond the legal resolution itself, has been reconnecting periodically with Elaine, who I now consider something between a witness and, unexpectedly, a friend, two people who never should have had reason to know each other, bound together by having survived, at different points, the same carefully constructed scheme. She told me something, near the end of our first conversation, that I've held on to since, that surviving something like this doesn't mean fully understanding why it happened. It means, eventually, simply refusing to let it define the rest of your story. There's a part of this story I've put off telling because it's the part that still catches in my throat every time I try to explain it, and that's the process of telling my own family and friends, people who had spent 3 years genuinely worried about me, who had shown up with meals during bad flare-ups, who had adjusted holidays and vacations around what they believed was a real, worsening illness, that the illness itself had been, in significant part, fabricated. My mother's reaction was one of the hardest conversations of the entire ordeal. She had spent 3 years quietly grieving a future she believed was closing in around her daughter, had made peace, in ways she only fully admitted to me afterward, with the idea that she might eventually be planning a funeral rather than watching me grow old. Learning that grief had been manufactured, deliberately, by someone she had welcomed into our family and trusted completely, produced an anger in her I had genuinely never witnessed before, calm and controlled as she typically is about nearly everything. My closest friend, Anna, who had driven me to more appointments than even Ryan had during the periods he claimed to be too busy with work, told me she'd actually had a fleeting, uneasy feeling more than once over those 3 years, a sense that something about the pattern of my decline didn't quite track the way she'd understood chronic illness to typically progress, based on her own mother's experience with a genuine autoimmune condition years earlier. She said she dismissed that feeling each time, telling herself she wasn't a doctor, that every illness progresses differently, that questioning it even privately felt like a betrayal of support I clearly needed. That ripple effect, if I can call it that, is something I think about often now. Instinct is often quieter and more reliable than we give it credit for. The trick is learning not to talk yourself out of it the way both Anna and I did, for entirely different but related reasons. For far too long that I don't tell this story to make anyone suspicious of every insurance policy or every attentive partner managing their medical care. Most people who take care of the administrative details of a relationship are doing exactly what they appear to be doing, helping, out of genuine love, nothing more complicated than that. What happened to me, and what happened to Elaine before me, was the result of one specific person's deliberate, sustained exploitation of exactly that ordinary, reasonable trust. If there's something practical I'd ask you to take from this, it's simple: request your own complete medical records periodically, directly from your providers, especially if someone else in your life has taken on the role of managing that communication for you. It costs very little time, and if there's ever a discrepancy, however small, it's worth understanding rather than dismissing, the way I very nearly dismissed that first strange phone call from the pharmacy. If you share finances with a partner, it's also worth periodically reviewing insurance policies together directly with the provider, rather than relying entirely on secondhand summaries, however trustworthy the person providing them has always seemed. I got my actual medical history back. I got real doctors working from real, accurate information for the first time in years. What I can't fully get back is the certainty I once had that the person managing my care, and my life, had my actual survival, rather than my documented decline, as his priority the entire time. I think, often, about how close both Elaine and I came to a very different ending, and about the specific, quiet role instinct played in both of our survivals, her decision to seek a second opinion when something felt subtly wrong, my decision to make one records request that didn't need to happen at all. I don't think either of us fully understood, in the moment, how much was riding on those small, ordinary decisions. I try, now, to trust that instinct more readily than I once did, in every part of my life, not just the parts that involve medicine or money. If this story affected you, or if you've ever discovered that someone you trusted had quietly rewritten a part of your own life without your knowledge, I want to hear about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and more of what I've learned rebuilding trust in my own life, every day.